The original 1818 text of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein engages many themes that were incredibly important to the time period, from the emergence of science and reanimation to the budding feminism and gender dynamics that were being discussed. Given the book's prevalence in society and media over the past 200 years, and the amount of retellings and new stories created in the image of Frankenstein, there has to be a connection between the themes of the novel and our current social environment. When COVID-19 struck, schools were shut down, and parents had to come up with new and exciting ways of keeping their kids intrigued and motivated on their online classes. Over in the UK, a recent poll found that 30% of parents do not intend on sending their kids back to school, 91% of which don't intend on sending their kids back in the foreseeable future at all. Reasons for this decision seem to vary, from the fact that parents might believe that their kids are learning better and having an easier time learning at home, to the concern that schools are not opening in the right way with the right restrictions and regulations. As of March 2020, there were about 2.5 million homeschool students in America, which is about 3 or 4% of the population of all kids in school. The number of families interested in continuing home education continues to grow. Though exact numbers are not out yet, an article from the NBC recently in September 2020 describes a community in Virginia which have homeschool communities that are growing by 200% and says that similar things are happening all over the country. These numbers relate specifically to families who want to take their children out of the public school system, pursuing their own private homeschool education, beyond the confines of online classes and, for American students, Common Core curriculum. With so many kids at home, both in traditional homeschool families and in this new pandemic school situation, the way kids learn and will continue to learn has to adapt and change. Many kids who were once in the public school system are no longer learning in a linear fashion, in classrooms with teachers who have to follow a strict curriculum and schedule. Instead, they are learning by experience and according to their interest, as homeschoolers have always done. This is even true for college students with asynchronous classes, which don't meet at a particular time and don't really allow for face-to-face interaction or verbal communication either. Education has become a very do-it-yourself mentality for college students as well, many of whom are left to teach themselves the material and kind of work through the interpretations of it, not really getting input from the professor until the final day that the assignment is due. For the college students that do have synchronous classes and time with their professor, a lot of these classes have become very multimodal, bringing different kinds of media into the rotation, similar to children learning during the COVID-19 crisis. College students are learning through doing and by experiencing and learning in a very extensive and expansive way. Similar to kids in grades K through 12 during the COVID-19 pandemic, college students are learning through doing, by experiencing, and by interpreting the materials themselves. Looking back to Frankenstein, we can see two very distinct modes of education present between Victor and the monster. In Frankenstein, Victor experiences a very traditional or expected style of education throughout his life, as pressured by his family and what his father expects of him. In Volume 1, Chapter 2, he writes, "When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary for the completion of my education that I should be made acquainted with the other customs than those of my native country." His experience with college is the very typical style of in-person learning that we're all used to. He attends lectures writing, "I departed highly pleased with the professor and his lecture." Then he proceeds to get a tour around the laboratory and is given a bunch of extra reading to do, which concerns all of the things that he learned in the lecture. This style of linear learning from lecture to lab to further reading feels exactly like the mode of learning kids in public schools and in colleges experience and are used to. This style prevents both benefits and drawbacks for Victor, as he is very intelligent and hard-working on his particular area of study, but often struggles to let go of his very straightforward, logical-based perspective, and has a lack of sociability, which he talks about on page 58 of my copy, which says, "Study has before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures, and rendered me unsocial. But Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature." So it talks about how he's not really able to gain that perspective of heart and looking at the beauty of the world because he is so focused on his particular craft and his very straightforward mentality. This can actually inform our current beliefs about education, and it can show the connection between the very linear model of education that Victor experiences and the potential difficulty with deviating from one's methods and the inability to see the experience of others and relate to new people. While this isn't the case for everyone who experiences this kind of linear mode of education, it is very clearly Victor's experience and can help us understand public education in the time of COVID-19. The creature actually learns very differently than this. He learns by seeing and by experiencing things for himself. Totally on his own, without the help of any teacher or curriculum, he learns things like compassion and kindness, which he talks about, as well as being able to learn about language, which he doesn't have any kind of instruction for. He does this completely by observing others, talking about how he sat and listened to people talk, learned words like fire, milk, and bread that were concrete objects that he could put a name to a particular object, and later he kind of learned concepts and ideas and constructs like good, dearest, and unhappy. In this way, the creature actually becomes literate and incredibly well-read, capable of having conversations and putting aside his own feelings, like he does when talking to Victor about the creation of a new creature. He's able to speak rationally and relate to the feelings of others. More than anything, though, his education is very technical and experiential. He can survive on his own, he can communicate with others, just as long as they don't see his appearance, for that matter. This model of education mirrors that of homeschooling much more closely than Victor's style of education. The downside of this type of education is that there is a potential for subjects to be lost in the shuffle. It is never entirely said whether or not the monster knows how to write, but he is incredibly literate at the same time, able to read all kinds of books. These gaps can be problematic later in life for homeschool students, as their parents might not have had the best knowledge of a particular subject. For online students during COVID-19, this can also mean that if their teacher fails to engage them properly in a particular subject, they might have gaps or holes later on in their education. The other potential problem is becoming a shut-in, a homeschooler, or in this case, most school-at-home kids, who are secluded like the monster was, with minimal social interaction. This can be a huge problem, as we see in Frankenstein, as the monster never really talks to the people he studies, causing him to only know as much as he can observe. In conclusion, Frankenstein can inform our present educational situation during the pandemic, helping us understand the positives and negatives associated with both traditional linear modes and more loose experiential and experimental modes of education.